Irish America had an enormous influence economically on ordinary people living in Ireland for a huge portion of the 19th and 20th centuries. Whether people know about that history within their families or not, it's often lost, but it happened for almost all families.
That's the voice of Dr. Damian Shiels, and I'm Martin Nutty, and you're listening to the Irish Stew podcast. It's been almost 4 years since we last had Damian on the podcast. In that time, he's been a busy man. I'll be talking with him about his new life in Finland, his new podcast, Transatlantic, where he has teamed up with another Irish Stew guest, Finn Dwyer of Irish History Podcasts. Damian and I will also talk about his new book, Blue and Green, which is a distillation of 15 years of in-depth work on Irish participation in the American Civil War. Irish Stew is proud to be a media partner of Irish Central, the trusted source for Irish news, history, travel, opinion, and cultural information. Please visit irishcentral.com for all the latest from Ireland and its diaspora. And now, on to Damian Shiels. Damian, great to have you back on the podcast again, and you are the first guest we've had on who is resident on the Gulf of Bothnia.
I'd say there's a lot of podcasts that could say that, Martin. Thanks for having me on again. Always good to be on Irish Stew.
So the last time we had you on was almost 4 years ago, and at that point, you were living in Cork. Now you're living in Finland full-time in a place called Jakobstad, which is about halfway up the western Finnish coast, if I'm correct.
Yeah, not even in the part of Finland that people know, which is down the south in Helsinki. Yeah. We're a long way up here. The rain has followed me from Ireland, though. But anyway.
Yeah. Finland's a pretty big country. Like, I think you're 500 kilometers or so from Helsinki, right?
I'm further than the length of Ireland away from Helsinki, and not even halfway up the country. It's huge. The population is the same as Ireland, so you can imagine the population density is pretty low. It's all forest around here. It's a bit of a change, although I am surrounded by my Irish books everywhere.
Tell me about the move. What triggered all that?
Well, fundamentally, I suppose there's a bit of a gripe in relation to that. Finland's a great country. My other half, Sarah, she's from here. This is her home place. And she's an archaeologist, the same as I started out with. I swap back between archaeology and history fairly frequently. So she was living in Ireland for 20 years with us, but I suppose it's one of the big issues in relation to, not to get political straight away, but we moved here because we couldn't afford to live in Ireland. We both worked in heritage all our careers, and as you get older, and it's not a very highly paid profession, and you don't have things like pensions and stuff. We got to an age where we needed really to have some security. Everybody in Ireland, I think, thinks in Finland's an exceptionally expensive country, and it is if you go drinking in Helsinki for a weekend. But if you actually live here, there's a significant difference in the cost of living. So we effectively moved here to get a house so that we could have some security, because it's so much better. And in that, we were helped a lot, I have to say, it was terrible COVID, but one of the things it did see a mass increase in is things like the ability to remote work and things like that. And we're both able to do that. We both spend most of our time, indeed, still working on Irish heritage material or history, archaeology. And so we were able to do that from here. And so that was what drove our decision to move.
So how do you get from Jakobstad back to Ireland? How involved is that trip?
It can be pretty involved. You do get used to traveling. Finland is very well connected, and it has great trains, which is fortunate for me. We live close to the kind of north-south train line. Actually, you often have a picture of Santa on the train I get, because it goes all the way up to Rovaniemi in Lapland, the Helsinki-Rovaniemi train. Yeah, so normally I would get a train down to Helsinki and then out of Helsinki to somewhere like Dublin, usually. I'm well used to airports at this stage. I think I've actually been out of the country every month this year, having started the year thinking I wasn't going to be going away that much. But yeah, you get used to kind of 18, 20, 22 hours on the road to different locales. You spend a lot of time traveling when you do have to travel.
Tell me about language challenges. I guess Swedish is spoken where you are, and Finnish, obviously. And now I understand Finnish is generally categorized as one of the hardest languages to learn. So are you taking a stab at that?
Yeah, my Finnish is terrible, right? So Well, I suppose one of the things that is challenging if you're moving somewhere like this and you're consistently working remotely, I spend most of my time where you see me now, in my office, in a room without much interaction. So I think there is a difference if you come when you're working directly in the community in terms of that. It makes it maybe a bit easier. But where I live is, I think, the town that still has a majority Swedish. About 60% of the people around Jakobstad speak Swedish as their first language. So a lot of people don't know that about Finland, actually, that it has these two languages. The area where I live along the coast opposite Sweden, and then down the south around Helsinki and stuff would be areas that have a Swedish-speaking community. About 6% of the Finnish population are native Swedish speakers. And most people here would be bilingual, that they could speak either or. But Swedish is a lot easier language to learn because it's an Indo-European language. There's a lot of ties to English and things you can understand it. Finnish, though, is one of the handful of languages in Europe that isn't like that. Estonian, Hungarian, Magyar, they're all related, these Finno-Ugric languages, and then Basque. So it is much more difficult to learn. My Swedish is far from fluent either, but I can get by with it. I'm trying to improve it all the time. But Finnish is definitely hard. I can only say a few words in it, but hopefully that will be improving as the years go on.
I was struck what little I know about Finland. There are some odd similarities with Ireland. They had a civil war around the time we had a civil war. They were occupied by both the Swedes and the Russians, I believe. So they are colonized. I'm not sure if that's the right word. Certainly occupied. Is that your read on it as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. The Sweden comparison, say, with Britain and Ireland is a bit more murky now and would still be the topic of debate. So you might have listeners who would disagree with this. But where Finland used to actually be part of Sweden proper. So say where I lived was part of Sweden longer than, say, down the south where Barry and everything, which was Danish. It was a long time. And I think there's still a lot of historic debate in relation to the role of Sweden as colonizers of Finland. Certainly there was a massive class distinction normally because Swedish speaking was the elite speaking language and Finnish wasn't. So there was a real difference in treatment. And so that's informed a lot of the history of the country. But Sweden loses Finland to Russia in a war, this most significant battle of which was fought just down the road to me, a place called Arvice, during the Napoleonic Wars. So Finland became a Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire from that period in about 1809, all the way through to 1917, when it gets its independence following the Bolshevik rise in Russia. And then it's a very interesting kind of dynamic then in Finland. It has a civil war almost immediately after that between the Reds and the Whites. And I find that a very interesting comparison with Ireland because Ireland, in many ways, is still defined a lot by its civil war and how bad it was. I think the recent research done suggests that something like 2,500 people are killed in the Irish Civil War. In the Finnish Civil War, which was the Reds and the Whites, there's something in the region, I think, and my figures might be off here, it's been a while since I read about it, but something like 50,000 people die in the Finnish Civil War. This is absolutely savage and created a lot of division that wasn't spoken about. And again, there's a Swedish-speaking, Finnish-speaking element to this too, but the Soviet Union becomes the kind of major 20th century enemy, if you like. Russia had been causing problems with these kind of Russification efforts in the late 19th, early 20th century. Finland had an unusual level of independence within the Russian Empire prior to that. And then, of course, in 1939, a lot of people will have heard of the Winter War, where the Soviet Union makes demands off of Finland. The Finns say no, and then the Soviets invade. And the Finns exact enormous casualties on the Soviets, but still have to give the Soviets everything that they wanted at the outset of that conflict, but retain their independence. And then in 1941, of course, controversially, they support the German attack on the Soviet Union and are involved then in what they call the continuation war here between 1941 and 1944, when they make a peace with the Soviet Union. And that kind of experience in the Second World War is quite interesting for what it does for the Civil War. So whereas in Ireland, the Civil War, you could argue, still remains quite relevant to the political parties that were formed out of it and so on. If the Civil War was almost suppressed, it still had meaning for people whose families were involved in the Civil War. But the Second World War was just such a massive traumatic event for the Finns. Like every church you go to in this country has beside it the graves of the war dead. And it's just enormous losses that you see from these, including many people in the area where I live. So I actually look at them quite a bit as well, the people who served in that conflict. And it informs things right through to today. So obviously a massive border, Russia, and the Finns would be very oriented. Sweden is still there. Finland and Sweden are playing ice hockey. You do not want to be losing to Sweden in ice hockey. But like England and Ireland, it's soccer. But Russia still remains what everyone is oriented towards. And so Finland still has military service. It's always prepared. And as the recent conflict in the Ukraine, Finland for many years been seen as almost this linking country where they were always careful in relation to how they were with Russia. I think that the threat caused by what happened in the Ukraine is what eventually led to the Finns deciding to join NATO. So a kind of a very serious move, if you like, for Finland to take because of the threat. So a lot of it has been oriented. Russia, of course, even when it was part of Sweden, Russia was consistently involved in Finland. There's periods in the 18th century called the Great Wrath, and a lot of the areas around me would have had areas where the Russians were here and things. So it's always been there. So Russia, like a lot of Eastern Europe, looms very large in relation to how the country views its independence and views its threats.
That's an extraordinary arc, and thank you for expanding my smaller than postage stamp size understanding of Finnish history.
Mine is somewhat limited, but yeah, that's the main point.
I'm curious, are you the only Irish person that you're aware of in your immediate locale? I can't imagine there's many Irish people. And how has this past year or so, I'm not sure how long you're there, maybe 2 years, informed?
Three now,
okay.
Yeah.
That informed your view of Ireland and your own Irishness. Because I think any time you switch location, you always end up doing comparisons. So I'm curious about your take there.
Yeah, that's a good question. From an Irishness perspective, there aren't very many Irish people where I live. I have heard that there was one person in Jakobstad at least, although I believe he moved south to Vasa, which is a city about an hour away south of us, about the same size as Limerick there. So there's not a big Irish community or even, say, British and Irish community around this area. Although there are some people. But most of the Irish community, and there is a fairly vibrant Irish community in Finland, is down the south. So about half the population, in fact more than that, live in the very south. The Helsinki, Tampere, which people might know is always voted the happiest city in Europe, and Turku. So they actually all have GAA teams now. Yeah. So the Helsinki Harps, I think it's the Tampere Hammer Gales, and I think the recent one is, I think they call themselves the Turku Delight. They recently had a hurling tournament, but that's a long way away from me. So there are some interesting ones. There's a Finnish international footballer who is a Finn, speaks Finnish, whose surname is O'Shaughnessy. That's Daniel O'Shaughnessy. So you do have these links there. I think it does have an impact on this, Martin, from living away for so long. It certainly has an impact on how you perceive things. I'm a lot freer to go into Irish bars now when I travel because I don't get going to Irish bars very much because I don't live in Ireland anymore. And I suppose a lot of people say this. I would be somewhat critical of some of the things in Ireland when you see Finnish social systems and things like that. That one of the ones from a heritage perspective, I would quite often point to, you have much more access to the landscape here than you would say in Ireland. You have a version of a thing that's across a lot of the Nordics called the Allman's Right. So you can effectively go and explore wherever you would like to explore around the forests. Most of it is forest, and like most forested country in Europe. But like out in nature, and people can access nature from a kind of a community level a lot easier than you can in Ireland, which property is a very big thing in Ireland on every level. So you see things like that. But some things, there's much less of a pub culture here than there would be in Ireland, for example. There's swings and roundabouts and things. But yeah, I think there's a lot, in my view, that Ireland could take from a country like Finland, if I'm being honest about it. Some things vice versa too, but I think on the balance of things, the Finns have got things largely right here, which makes it a good place to live. You know yourself, you always miss home. It's nice to get back every once in a while.
Yeah. What I'm going to do now is I want to switch over to one of the other major pieces of work you've embarked on since you were last on Irish Stew, which is a joint effort with one of our other guests, Finn Dwyer. And last October, I believe, or August last year, 2024, you launched Transatlantic, which is a podcast which focuses on the relationship between Ireland, and America. So tell us about the backstory there, how that came to be. I understand you used to work with Finn long before his podcasting era.
Long before, and despite the fact that he's from Kilkenny, which I'm always slagging him off about on the podcast, Finn was one of the earliest adopters of podcasts in Ireland, actually, and has an incredible podcast of his own, the Irish History podcast, that I'm sure many of your own listeners will be aware of. Yeah, but we worked on a big excavation. It's actually where I met Sarah. It's the reason I'm in Finland. So it's a very influential excavation in Carrickmines Castle in South County Dublin. Anybody who knows Dublin, the M50 motorway, it was proper Celtic Tiger stuff. But yeah, so that was a big castle excavation. We were out there for 2 years, and myself and Finn worked on that together. So I'd known each other from then, and then Finn got into podcasting and has this enormously successful show. And we'd done bits and pieces together over the years, but he suggested Transatlantic and talking about Irish American history and the wealth of Irish American history would be a good show, and I was well up for it. And obviously a lot of what I do is Irish American history, so I thought it was a good opportunity to delve into, as you're aware, Martin, I spent a lot of my time looking at the 1860s and the Civil War and things like that, but to have an opportunity to branch out as well and discuss some other elements of Irish American history and identity. And so we're having great fun with this. We're well into season 2 now of that. So I think we have about something like 20 episodes in the bag or something that are out there. So just looking at different individuals, different time periods, and the whole kind of transfer of Irish identity to America and back again, and the different periods, obviously things like the impact the Great Famine has, and exploring all these different facets of Irish America. It's just such an ocean of topics. You could just spend your life looking at all the different elements of it. So it's, yeah, good fun. It's good fun. And it allows me to occasionally talk about stuff that I know a lot about, and quite a lot talk about things that I know significantly less about. And we have our periods where we discuss things together, and then have a series of guests who come in and discuss things with us.
Yeah, I've been impressed with the conversational vibe you guys got going, which I think works really well. It sounds effortless. And I know your area of specialty is 19th century history, but it ain't just 19th century history you guys are doing. You're doing everything from back to the Viking era all the way up to 20th century. These episodes are like an hour long, maybe even a little bit longer. Talk to me about the research effort behind that.
We're trying hard now to try and keep them between 45 to 50 minutes if we can, but we're failing often. Yeah, so it does depend. A lot of it, I have a lot of Irish American history books generally, and I think it helps for some of the earlier episodes coming from an archaeological background too. So the Viking stuff, for example, I've done a lot of Viking archaeology kind of adjacent things, and you can start discussing about Irish links to there. Also, obviously, the earlier periods in the 16th, 17th century and things like Jamestown and stuff, and we've discussed Irish links in with those periods. I spent a lot of time in that period in Irish archaeology, and it's a lot of actually the same people who are involved in that. You know, and Finn has big interest in things like labour history and things like that. We're able to bring a nice mix together. As you know as well, Finn has done a huge amount of series on things like the Irish famine and stuff like that. He's working on one on 1798 as well for his own podcast. So we were tying a lot of that into recent episodes we did on the American Revolution. Sometimes it's completely out where you just get to explore something really new. Like one of the ones we had this season now was Typhoid Mary, who we looked at, who was someone who I knew tangentially, but didn't get an opportunity to dive in. And you spend a few days reading articles and trying to consume what's out there academically and in popular culture as well about these people before discussing it. But then guests are always great to have on. Megan Smoleniak, who's a great genealogist based in the States, has a new book out about Annie Moore, who was the first person to Ellis Island, a Cork immigrant woman. And you can get those type of experts in. Jake Wynn, a friend of mine in Pennsylvania, talking about life in the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania. And when you have people on who are as knowledgeable about that type of stuff, conversations naturally flow, as you well know, Martin, from your own work, that it's easy to have conversations. I think we feel we still have a long way to go now in terms of our conversationality, but it's been good fun.
It's certainly been working for me. One of the episodes that you guys covered is titled, We Share a History, but Are Irish Americans Really Irish? Which is applying some of the area that John and me work on our podcast. I'm wondering, have you guys had any feedback on that from the Irish side, from the American side? How did that land?
the feedback was positive in relation to that. I suppose if you're listening to a podcast called Transatlantic, an Irish American history podcast, you're probably predisposed to have a relatively positive type of response to something like that. But what prompted us to have it is conversations. I've had them with you, Martin, on numerous occasions in the past, just privately. It's something that anybody who engages, I think, with Irish American history comes across fairly regularly. This kind of idea that you have to be from Ireland to be Irish or to have a claim on any element of Irish identity. And it's always been a huge bugbear of mine. This idea that if an American comes in, and SNL do sketches about it and things like that, an American comes into a bar in Ireland and goes, I'm Irish. And everybody goes, oh, yeah. Well, which party of is Irish? And again, these things are amplified online, but you would regularly see it online under posts about stuff going, this person isn't Irish, this is an American or whatever. And so it was always something that from the very outset we wanted to tackle it. And we're hoping to do other episodes in relation to that to talk about people. We want to do one in this series about people's idea of home, Irish Americans' idea of Ireland, people who've maybe managed to make the trip back to Ireland or who've never managed to make the trip back to Ireland. But I think anybody who looks seriously at Irish American history sees that there is a melding of identity there that makes Irish American identity a legitimate identity to have. And because it's an Irish American identity, doesn't mean that it's an Irish Ireland identity. It's not the same experience as someone who was born and grew up in Ireland. But you can't have an immigrant population that we've had all across the country and then go, oh, the minute you've gone, these people have absolutely no entitlement to have any claim to holding an element of the identity. And one of the things that we explored, we were wandering around Waterford in the rain, actually, it was one of our few in-person ones because Finn's normally in Ireland and I'm normally in Finland. One of the things we were discussing in that are what I often term, people in Ireland would call a plastic paddy identity. You would hear it from people, the idea of people running around with shillelaghs and all this kind of the imagery around St. Patrick's Day and stuff like that. And that was one of the things we were discussing about how certain elements of that identity, actually, you can trace back to Irish 19th century identity. And that, of course, is the mass wave of Irish immigration to the United States. An identity that was Irish. Things like the shillelagh when faction fighting is happening and things like that's very common in Ireland in the 19th century. And it almost gets fossilized as Irish America forms its own Irish American identity. And you can argue, of course, as many people discuss, as to the extent to which Irish American identity is diluting, or is there an Irish America anymore? It's often talked about in terms of American politics or whatever. But that there's this kind of fossilization of the Irish identity among the new Irish communities in the United States that kind of is passed down as an Irish identity. That's a perfectly legitimate identity to have, and to have this affection and interest for Ireland. I have a big problem with people in Ireland trying to just deny that to people. You're not born and raised in Cork. You can't say Irish anywhere in your identity. You're just purely one thing or the other. And one of the things, and you had a great episode, forgive me, I can't remember. It's one of my favorites of yours, the lady who...
Kate Carrigan.
Yeah, that was super. And that resonated with me because, okay, I'm quite fortunate, I have an Irish accent, right? I sound like I'm from Ireland. Some people might dispute the extent to which I do sound like I'm from Ireland, but I was born in London, right? And my parents moved back. They're both Irish immigrants to London. They moved back when I was 10 months old, and I grew up with an Irish accent. The difference I would have had, I'm sure, in school if I grew up, and you often hear this with people who have English accents in particular, who have exactly the same background as me, who would automatically be denied their Irish identity because of the way they sound. That really resonated. I think we actually referenced that episode maybe in that show that you had, because that gets at the root of it really, as to what is this claim, who has an entitlement to say things. And I fully accept to vote and make political decisions or whatever, like in parliamentary democracies and stuff. There's different levels, but there are levels, and you can't just blanket deny stuff. Anyway, that was what we were trying to get at with that, because it does all have a historical basis. That's the point of all of this. And it's one of the reasons we try and touch on some of those things in the show. And we often bring it back in different elements. From my own work in the 19th century, Martin, for example, where someone is born doesn't really impact whether you're part of the Irish ethnic grouping in the United States in the 19th century. Plenty of people who were born in the United States or Britain or Canada are seen as ethnically Irish and view themselves as ethnically Irish in the 19th century. And things don't change that much. So it's just a really interesting topic generally. And I think it's something that nearly every country is grappling with today, just as it was in the past.
Yeah, and I'm interested in your choice of the word grappling because that implies, let's say, a certain degree of tension.
Yes.
And you
Yeah.
also refer to the fact of, let's say, residents of Ireland denying the Irishness of others that, let's say, haven't lived in Ireland, weren't born in Ireland, or may very well be like Kate Harrigan, resident in Ireland, but have, as she describes it, a tan accent. But it also feels to me that there is almost the lack of education and understanding this broader diaspora and the associated, let's say, networking / economic opportunities that are available once you understand it in a more comprehensive and sensitive way. I deal myself with some of these issues in Ireland. I administer a Facebook group for my sins, which has 16,000 members for Irish athletics, or track and field, as we say over in America. And needless to say, with the rise of a number of folks of African ancestry in the sport, I find myself dealing with issues on that board that are quite racially charged from an administration point of view. And again,
Yeah, I can imagine.
we have athletes that are born in Ireland, but there are a very vocal few that aren't scared of popping off on these issues as to what is Irish and what is not. I think once you start scratching the surface of any Irish person, which I usually tell most people is, especially from Dublin origin, you'll find an English person quite quickly. I spend a lot of time on genealogy, just how diverse Irish people can actually be.
To tie it back to, I suppose, what we started the show with as to why I moved to Finland, I think you notice that a lot on social media in Ireland. Anytime, for example, the housing crisis is brought up on social media, you will immediately see a long string of comments in relation to why there is a housing crisis in Ireland, which is usually brilliant on immigration, which that's, in my mind, there was a housing crisis in Ireland long before there was any major immigration. It's a significantly more complex issue that I think is almost a get out of jail card, really, to be honest, to be blaming it on immigrants. And again, to bring it back to Transatlantic, and we were discussing this, there's a bit of a perception that Ireland was this closed off location. There's been a new documentary on RTE. I haven't seen the documentary yet that explores some of the diversity in Ireland, that you see this. And of course, the problem with social media, again, is it seems to just be a magnet for that sort of commentary. And you can look at this and you can go, my God, this is huge. Everybody is thinking this, but I think most people tend to be fairly measured in what they put up or choose not to put up or engage with in relation to this. So it's often left to the most extremes who are commenting on it. But we were discussing in a Transatlantic one quite recently. I spent a lot of time looking at things, for example, like Irish in the British Army in the 19th century. And so there's a mass influx and outflux of people, even in those periods. There's an image sometimes of somebody in West Kerry. And I'm not saying that most of the people there aren't white or anything like this, but that there is a consistent engagement with the wider world, be it with poor people enlisting in the British Army and ending up in India or Africa. We were exploring in our American War of Independence one, some work I was doing a few years ago, looking at things like Black Americans coming into Ireland and serving in things like the Louth Militia and things like this in the 1790s. There's a Black soldier in the British Army born in Athlone in the 18th century and stuff. And narratives quickly build up. And I don't think there's any question, Ireland is like probably the last of Western Europe to have had a major diversification of the islands. Britain had it a lot long before us, France, for obvious reasons, because of their engagement in empire and stuff. But I look at things like the athletics to see the positives that come out of this. These things are never static. And you see it consistently. You were there, Martin, when we were down in the old areas of the 5 Points, where the Irish lived in Manhattan. And then new waves of immigrants came in, and where the Irish live down in Manhattan is now Chinatown and Little Italy. And you just see this new waves. And I think you can see how that strengthened the United States, for example, over the course of its period. And so these things come, and again, not to get too political, I tend to try and always avoid being as political as I can, but there's a kind of a recurrence to a lot of this sort of stuff that happens. And I think often the problems, as I would contend, the housing issue in Ireland is much more a structural problem than it is to do with any of this. But it's easier, I think, for some people to look at it this way. It's one of the reasons that looking at things like the Irish diaspora, I think, is a really important tool. And I will say this, and I've contended this for a long time, I don't think there's enough education in Ireland in relation to the Irish diaspora and Irish people around the world. I think we're good at saying the diaspora should come back and explore Ireland, which is fine. I think we do need to do more. There should be more programs on RTE and stuff about the Irish diaspora and things like that. There's been some good work done, but there needs to be more done in exploring Irish people around the world and the impact that they had on those locations, and also the positive influences, the negative influences, and just how it wasn't all kind of one group of wealthy people. I spent a lot of my time looking at working class, ordinary people. They're what interests me. I spend a lot of time at the moment researching Irish involvement with Native Americans in the United States, which is a very controversial subject, because obviously what happens to the Native American people, but exploring those type of interactions, because I think if you want to understand where everybody is coming from and how things are influenced, you have to look and have some knowledge about these people. And it's not always black and white, these people are bad and these people are good or whatever. History is much more complicated than that.
Just in terms of the housing, we'll probably leave this. We could spend an hour just talking simply about that.
It's the first time on a podcast I've ever discussed the housing thing.
I'll tell you a housing story. I have a letter written by my grandmother to her sister in Chicago right before she gets married. It's about 1922 or 1923 in Ireland. And she expresses a concern that she is going to find a great deal of difficulty finding a place to live. And the fact that her and her husband-to-be may have to take a back room in a tenement in Dublin. When I hear about the housing thing, don't get me wrong, this is a significant contemporary issue in Ireland, but it was a significant issue in the Ireland of the early 1920s, and you can make the case that actually the rise of Eamon de Valera to power was being forthright in attempting to address the issue of housing. Indeed, the very first suburbs of Dublin, places like Crumlin, etc., were built on the backs of de Valera campaign promises. And I see it playing out in my family again, and we hope that the existing Irish government is going to take it every bit as seriously as de Valera took it as a political opportunity. He's not a man that is much venerated in contemporary Ireland, but he did understand the salience of the issue and the need to act upon it.
And to bring it back to Finland, Martin, it's one of the most noticeable things here, but it's just a different attitude. And people have easy access to housing here. That's just the way the country is set up. And it's not an issue really in Finland as a result of that, to any great degree. And it's a policy decisions that kind of drive a lot of that. Whether, and I'm not going to get into the political scenario in Ireland, but it is. And of course, it's what people want culturally. And I think Ireland still has a lot of stuff that goes back to the 19th century and stuff in relation to land and property and things that aren't as prevalent in other countries. And that's also a hangover of history that you have there. People have their views on that. And again, it feeds a bit back into just what we were talking about in relation to the identity thing. And it's one of the reasons you're talking about the historic issue of housing and stuff like that and people struggling in Ireland. One of the other things that I feel very strongly about that there isn't really great understanding of in Ireland is there's a concept that the diaspora, the 19th, the early 20th, the mid 20th century diaspora just left and they were gone and that was it. But actually, when you start looking at the history, what you see is this massive amount of assistance and aid that's coming back. And I'm not just talking about the aid for things like Irish nationalism. I'm talking about economic aid for families and stuff. And you see that all the time when you dive in to correspondence and stuff of this constant stream of support that comes back, if you like, for those of us who were left in Ireland from those who emigrated. And as the generations have gone on, there's been this divergence where people now who are in Ireland don't necessarily see that as part of their own history. But that support that the diaspora gave to Ireland is another one of the reasons I think we're talking about that identity and stuff is important, because Irish America had an enormous influence economically on ordinary people living in Ireland for a huge portion of the 19th and 20th centuries. Whether people know about that history within their families or not, it's often lost. But it happened for almost all families that was occurring. This massive flow back of the people who left. The ones who would contend were seen to have had an obligation to support the people who were left back in Ireland who didn't go. And that's an enormous part of that kind of intertwining as well, I think, of the identities that go on. And it's too easy now where people can just too often people just look at politics, don't they? They just look at politics and just class people based on that. And it's much more complicated, much more nuanced, and much more interesting, to be honest, than that.
I could keep going on this subject area, but I need to get to your latest book, which came out in April of this year, published by LSU Press, Green and Blue, Irish Americans in the Union Military, 1861 to 1865. This is your third book in this space of 19th century and Irish American participation in the Civil War. Why is there a third book? Why did there need to be a third book?
Well, this is the most important one of the three, although you might think I would say that because it's the last one. But it is that, so the first one was like a compendium of stories, really. So that just to give a flavour of the Irish in the Civil War. The second one, anybody who knows anything I do knows I spend a lot of time with these pension files, incredible documents that thousands and thousands of Irish people applied for based on military service that kind of tell the story of 19th century Irish people in a way that no documents anywhere in the world do. And so the second book dove into just looking at about just over 20 families from those. But this one is a broader analysis of the Irish in the Civil War. I had been working all the time in the background on this when I was doing the other books. And this is a much harder one to produce because I spent about 15 years going through these sources, looking for correspondence of Irish Americans who served in the war to try and gain a wider appreciation of their service. We all know about the Irish Brigade and things like that, but often that's kind of all that we focus on. But the Irish served in gigantic numbers all through the US military. And so I wanted to do a book that looked at not only who these people were, but how many of them were there, where they served, and then started using this correspondence. In the end, about 1,400 letters, I think I found across the 15 years, written by these guys to see what did it tell us about why they were serving and what were their motivations and how did they compare to other soldiers and everything. So that was how I produced that book. I was lucky enough when I had spent years and years doing this database and I met Professor David Gleeson, who's a great historian of the Irish in the South, Civil War historian at Northumbria. And he encouraged me and persuaded me to do a thesis. So I left archaeology for a while and I went off to do an analytical study of the material I'd gathered. And so all that together ended up in the book. Yeah, it's quite fortunate because one of the big problems that we've had in people who look at the Irish and the American Civil War has been a lack of letters from ordinary guys. People have tried an awful lot of really innovative ways of trying to get around that. But normally it leads to having to focus on these ethnic units like the Irish Brigade, which are quite different to the kind of mass experience of the Irish in the Civil War. But these letters that are preserved in pension files, because mothers and wives handed them in to the American government to prove their relationship to somebody who had died in service, record all of this information, saying why they served and what they thought about the United States and how loyal citizens were they and everything. So that's where that book lies, in that trio of, hopefully there'll be more as well. I never get tired of writing about the Irish in the Civil War. And it's such a massive conflict from an Irish perspective. Speaking of stuff that isn't very well understood or recognised in Ireland, that's certainly up there.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You made reference to the pension files. Give us a sense of the scale of the pension files and how do you go about identifying Irish-specific people? It's not like somebody, when these files were created, tagged the file and said, this is an Irish person.
No. So there are two types. There are these widows and dependent files. So these are claims made by parents or by widows or by children of somebody who served. And then there are veterans files, right? But a good friend of mine, Jackie Bedell, who now works with me on another project, the Andersonville Irish Project, looking at Irish in Andersonville, she oversaw a digitization of just a small portion of the widows pension file series. But it still ended up in I think there's about 165,000 of them that have been digitized, in and around about 160,000 odd that have been digitized, which is only just a small percentage of the total. There's well over It runs into the millions. They're stored in the National Archives down in Pennsylvania Avenue in DC. And so what I started doing back in late 2010 was the way they're organized is they're by unit, by state. So it might be New York, and then you go into New York, and then it's by infantry, cavalry, artillery, and then you go in there, and then it has the unit, which might be the 69th New York or whatever it is, 42nd New York, and then by company, and then it's just a name. There's no identifier. So what I did was, over the course of those 15 years, was I went into every single one of those states, units, companies, and I used generally surname analysis, and I would open a file, and then I would assess the images, and they can run from a few dozen pages, say, to well over 100 pages. And I would assess it to see if there was original wartime correspondence in it. And I created a massive database based off of that to try and capture this broad swathe of Irish Americans. So I ended up with guys in every state, every branch of service, every theatre of war that the United States fought in, correspondence that relates to them. And then because the pension files are so rich in terms of their information, so there'll often be information about the family in the decades prior to the war and the decades after. They're really an incredibly important resource to look at the story of Irish women. So people are given statements about their lives, what people worked at, their economic conditions. And so you get this very broad contextual picture. So it's not just an isolated letter. It's the entire story of a family. And when you look at enough of them and build them together, you can build a broader picture of what the experience was like. And so that was way behind it. And that's one of the reasons I think they haven't been looked at. They've been looked at in significant numbers by people looking at African Americans, increasingly so. A book called Come Be just won the Pulitzer Prize. Hedda Fields Black wrote a fantastic book that uses the pension files as a kind of a core element of this exploration of these enslaved people on the Combahee River. But they haven't really been seen as being offering the same for immigrants, and they do offer that. Not just Irish immigrants from Germany, all over Europe, but possible to do the same sort of thing with them. And so they give you this insight, which forms, if you like, the kind of core of that book then. It is what were these guys' economic conditions and then what they're saying about their service and things like this.
So how big a gap is left, you think? How much more from an Irish perspective is there to be discovered here? If you hired a battery of researchers, how long would it take to troll through all the files? Because obviously you're using surname analysis to say, okay, there's a likelihood that this person is Irish, but as we know, there's a lot of English names that were prevalent in Ireland.
A good example is the project that we've been running called the Andersonville Irish Project that has looked at the nearly 13,000 Union prisoners who died in Andersonville in Georgia. And for that, we looked at the cemetery, and we've systematically been going through people to look to see if they're Irish in that. And that's quite interesting because a lot of people say, for example, in Dublin, don't have necessarily, they're not called O'Malley or whatever. They have names that could be English, they could be American. That's showing the degree to which you need to be doing stuff like that to try and pull out a lot of Irish Church of Ireland, Irish Presbyterians out of that analysis. I've said this repeatedly. There needs to be significant numbers of Irish historians working on these files. And to my knowledge, there still isn't significant numbers working on them because they are offering all these insights, but you do have to do the hard graft. I have tagged now quite significant proportions of them and have databases all over the place now on different Irish people. So there is a mass body of information there that's just waiting to be discovered. And it's important for Ireland as well, not just the United States. So there are people claiming these pensions in Ireland that are handed in sometimes extraordinary things like eviction notices from landlords in Ireland or discussing people who were never in the United States, but one of their family was, and discussing, for example, things like the loss of children, where children died, where they were married, who married them, all these sort of interconnected social networks that just can't be captured anywhere else because they're in these files. So really there is a need for a colossal amount of work on them. I think one of the issues, they've been hard to look at, and I think people also get blocked off by, these are military files. But of course the information in them is in large part not military at all. They just are created as a result of a war. but the information in them is general, broad social history about living conditions, who was paying for the fuel, what fuel were people getting, what possessions did they have. All this sort of stuff is contained in these files. And particularly from an Irish perspective, I think there needs to be an awful lot more Irish historians looking at them in significant detail to pull them out. But I have been banging that drum for about 15 years without a huge amount of success, we said elsewhere, to try and get people significantly interested in them. Many of your listeners are probably familiar with the military pensions from the Irish War of Independence and things that have been digitized so brilliantly by the military archives in Ireland and are such an incredible resource, and have been used by many historians in Ireland to do incredible things, looking at, for example, the experience of women in the revolutionary period. The American pensions are like a supercharged version of them, both in terms of numbers and often in terms of the amount of information that's in them. They're just an extraordinary resource. Extraordinary.
Yeah, and just for our listeners, Damian kindly made an episode on Transatlantic, which just recently released about the pension files. So it's a great intro to the whole subject area. And I will say, as somebody that's interested in genealogy, just purely from that point of view, there's a huge opportunity to identify Irish history, Irish family history that may very well be lost because there are scant records in Ireland from the early 19th century. A lot of that has to do, of course, with the fire in the Four Courts at the outbreak of the Irish Civil War, destroyed an extraordinary number of documents. And so there's this big gaping hole. I'm not saying what's in the pension files is going to fill that hole. It won't. But this is a different repository that was never stored in the Four Courts. And it's really rich.
Yeah, we have no complete census prior to 1901 in Ireland. Just actually this week, the Virtual Treasury, which is, I encourage people to check that out, have released enormous amounts of data that they've been able to recreate from other archives. Go and check that. But yeah, if you had a family member who might, and some people, and people often contact me in relation to this because I've written on the Irish American Civil War site about these pension files for many years, and regularly still people contact me and go, "Oh, you discussed my family member here. I never knew that they had all this information in relation to them." And it's just so detailed. It's incredible. Very few of them have letters. We estimate maybe 5% or something might have a letter in them. But even if they don't, they reveal so much about Irish people on both sides of the Atlantic in this period, and things like the obligation to pay money back to Ireland and things, just all in there. It's, to my mind, Ireland should be funding further digitization of this material because of its importance for 19th century Irish life. It's just extraordinary.
I've probably got a dozen questions about your book, but I want to focus on the issue of Irish racism, which I think is topical, certainly for the contemporary moment. And in your book, you allude to the fact that the Irish were no different than many other white people in America and their racist attitudes towards people of African extraction. Is that a mindset that is adopted when white people come into America and they say that is the norm? Or is it a pre-existing condition that Irish immigrants arrived into America with?
That's one of the big debates in history in relation to Irish America. Frederick Douglass, and I actually use this quote and he's often used, Frederick Douglass talks about this because Frederick Douglass had gone to Ireland and he saw Ireland and had a good experience in terms of his interaction with the people he met there. And he talks about how the minute the Irish step off the boat, they're radically racialized in terms of how they view African Americans, in terms of how quickly they become incredibly racist. And even in the mid-19th century, Irish Americans have a reputation among white groups of being particularly racist towards blacks. The New York draft riots of 1863, when working class New Yorkers rise up against the draft, because most of the people on Manhattan who are working classes, because it's dominated by Irish people, it's dominated by Irish riot, and they do target African Americans in that, and they burn the Coloured Orphan Asylum, etc. And when I was looking at the correspondence, that you see the attitude towards African Americans. I'm sorry to say it was there. And I would make this strong argument in the book. I don't see it as this famous argument about the Irish had to become white and things like this and that they're fighting for their position. I don't see that in terms of what people are saying in their correspondence. What I see are a people, and I use some examples in the book to try and put forward this argument, who before they ever leave Ireland secure in their ideas of white supremacy. Because again, to touch what we were talking about before, we do have this image sometimes, and I fall into this trap myself of thinking of these people in a potato field somewhere in West Kerry who've never seen anything 3 miles outside the parish, suddenly going over to America. But we forget things like the interactions of the military, which are a very big element of this in the British Empire on Ireland. So most of the major port cities are continually connected to Empire, and huge numbers of ordinary poor Irish are going out into Empire as members of things like the British military or the civil service later and things like that. So people do know, and they're not isolated from racial conceptions of the time. And I put forward a couple of examples where I feel it demonstrates that in relation to a couple of individuals in the war. I don't think there's a big mystery in relation to Irish attitudes towards race personally in the mid-19th century, right? Every white person, apart from people who were genuinely seen as absolutely radical, right? So even most abolitionists in the 19th century are racist by our modern terms, right? They do not, most abolitionists don't see black people as equal. Some of them do, right? But there's other elements to abolitionism and things that would see the Irish not be fans of abolition. A lot of abolitionists are inordinately anti-Catholic, like hugely, and do not like Catholics. A lot of abolitionists are religiously motivated. And so you have that element of it. But then if you put into the mix, you have Irish sitting at the bottom, effectively, of the white working classes, right? They do see African Americans as their direct threat. Analogy I use is it was pretty easy to sit up uptown Manhattan in your big mansion and espouse abolitionism and how it's not going to have an impact. I'm not saying any of this is right now, of course, right? But this is just to explain it. To espouse the ideals of emancipation and stuff, if it's not having any potential direct threat on you. But if you are at the bottom and people who you view, like the rest of white society, as your racial inferiors, and you see them as a direct threat to your ability to provide for your own family, you have the absolute perfect breeding grounds for fairly intense animus towards African Americans, which is what you get by and large. And let's not overstate it. There are about 250,000 ethnic Irish in the United States forces. They don't all have this view. I think there's good evidence that a lot of them have racist views, but the Emancipation Proclamation comes in the American Civil War. The Irish do not en masse leave the United States military, right? They stay in the United States military in very large numbers. So you see there where it ranks for them. The preservation of the United States and the Union, for the men in uniform, at least, for the majority of them, is more important to them than emancipation. So they're not turning their back on it. So again, we have to remember these things are layered. But that's my reading of it from the evidence. That's what we're seeing, that the Irish are on the lowest level of a white stratification of society. They're the lowest class level of a society that is overwhelmingly racist in the way it's viewed it. And so if you're at that level, you're living on the economic margins. A lot of the time you see that a lot in this Irish correspondence. You see this as a potential threat. So that is how I view it. But I certainly don't feel, again, to go back to the Ireland issue, that it's as cut off and that they're not exposed to the idea that white people and white Europeans are better than non-Europeans, non-white Europeans. That was a broadly held view across much of Europe.
So there was opportunities to become racist long before they docked in Manhattan or Boston or Philadelphia or New Orleans. What's striking about what you just said is it feels to me over 150 years later that some of these levers are being pulled still, because a lot of the, let's say, ethnic difficulties we have in America, and I also see in Western Europe, are based on an appeal to economic fragility, a lot of times in the working class. And so some things are not particularly new. They occur over and over again.
And it's one of the reasons I think it's such an interesting period to look at in terms of immigrants moving into the United States in the 19th centuries. For the Irish, the big problem that they had really largely with most of them were Catholics. That was a big problem in the mid-19th century United States. That Know Nothing party in the 1850s. And as I say, some fairly senior abolitionists, They do not like these people. And the thing, I tried to drive this home in the book as well. One of the things I think is largely left out of a lot of Civil War studies even is class. The class dynamic is enormous in this, right? So the Irish are the poor, they're the working classes, right? And I think class is left out of a lot of discussions today, in fact, and even you see it in Ireland, communities that have been deprived of stuff for ages. And then it's pretty easy to then just turn around on them and go, oh, you're just all racist as well. It's much more complicated than that to look at the impact of being deprived of what a lot of society in the middle and upper classes take as red, and then just turn around on people. You see that a lot in the 19th century. So a lot of the problems the Irish have in relation to, say, how officers might view them and things like that are as much based on them being looked down upon because of their perceived position in class, because of their ethnicity. So you have that double whammy coming in there. And yeah, it's all just complicated, isn't it? And we try and reduce everything to these kind of simple, you're right and I'm wrong, and this is the reason you're doing this, without kind of a knowledge of what's driving a lot of it.
Yeah, nothing is binary here. And Green and Blue, your lovely book, just illustrates how complex a picture that is. And it certainly appeals to the data nerd in me because it's filled with tables which start breaking down the Irish in America. And it's an extraordinary piece of work. And I can't recommend it strongly enough. So unfortunately, we're getting to that point in time where we have to say goodbye again. Hopefully we have the opportunity sometime in the next few years.
I'm only coming back if it's in McSorley's, Martin. That's the agreement now. This was made, if anybody's listening off camera before, I want to get the McSorley's bar recording. We'll have to do that for a fourth. A beer tasting episode.
I'm sure we can arrange that. We've had one foray there. We'll just have to start early in the day, usually at 11:30 in the morning, when the sawdust is laid freshly down. But on behalf of our listeners and, of course, of myself, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Damian Shiels for joining us. It's been a real pleasure understanding all that has happened over the last 4 years in your life. And again, getting some insight into the huge swath of work you're engaged in. Total delight.
Thanks, Martin. It's always a great pleasure to be on Irish Stew. So look forward to the next time already.
It's long go fall. Hey, it's Martin. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Damian Shiels. Please make sure you check our show notes for links to his book, Blue and Green, Irish Americans in the Union Military 1861 to 1865. You can also visit Irish Stew Podcast, where you'll find a page for each of the 127 episodes we've released so far. There, you can sign up for our newsletter on the home page. We'll send updates to your email box on all the latest Irish Stew news. For now, John and I are going to take a break in the month of August, but we'll be back again in September with more great global Irish nation conversations. This is Martin Nutty, and you've been listening to the Irish Stew Podcast. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.